In this lecture, we are going to continue our exploration of the Roman Empire. We will be looking at the High Empire and the Late Empire, transitioning into the Middle Ages. Now, we left off last time in the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire had actually reached its greatest geographical existence and the height of its power. Domitian, the last of the early empire rulers, his rule, he was not well liked. In fact, his lifestyle and ego were comparable, were both in excess, and they were comparable to the Emperor Nero, who, remember, committed suicide to avoid assassination. Domitian also angered the Senate, and he was assassinated in 96 CE. The Senate then chose Nerva, whose reign was 96 to 98 CE, to rule. He was elderly, and he only ruled for 16 months. However, he created a pattern of succession by adoption, and this pattern actually continued for almost a century. So basically what would happen, think of, Julius Caesar adopting Octavian, who was his grandnephew. What would happen is the emperor would adopt the person he wanted to be his successor. So basically the ruling emperor would choose the next emperor. And again, this continued for almost a century. So Nerva chose Trajan. Trajan was born in Italic Spain, and he became the first non-Italian emperor of the Roman Empire. He was a general in the army. He expanded Rome's rule even further and instituted a number of social programs. He was also granted the title Optimus, meaning the best, by the Senate. And Trajan and Augustus became the measuring sticks for the emperors. They were seen as kind of the epitome of what a good emperor should do. One of the things that Trajan did was he created Timgad, founded in 100 CE. And this was a new colony for army veterans at Timgad, which is today in Algeria. Now, you can see from the sky view, the formation, it follows the pattern of a military encampment, meaning it was very formally structured. It was a square that was divided into equal quarters, and it was divided by the two main roads. We've already mentioned these before, the Cardo and the Decameros. The forum is where the two roads would intersect, and then each quarter is subdivided into square blocks. So you could see this was very well planned out. And the plan is actually a modification of the Hippodamian plan for Greek cities. And what would happen is Romans would lay out most of their new settlements in this way. And so what this did was it created uniformity throughout the vast empire and also expresses the central power of the Roman Empire. Another of one of Trajan's building projects, and this is usually considered one of the most important one, and this is his forum. This was actually twice the size of Augustus's forum, and it glorified Trajan's two victories over the Dacians, which is in present-day Romania. The architect was Apollodorus of Damascus, and he had been Trajan's chief military engineer. Now, this forum incorporated the main features of earlier fora, which is plural for forum, except it had a huge basilica. It's number 4 on the image here, and not a temple actually dominated the colonnade open square. The temple, which is number 1, was completed after Trajan's death and was dedicated to him. Remember, they turned most of their rulers, their emperors, into gods after their death. So this is why you have a temple to Trajan. The temple actually stood behind the basilica, facing 2 libraries, which are number 3, and a giant commemorative column, which is number 2. And then we also have the basilica. The basilica was called the Basilica Oppia, which is Trajan's family name, and it was very large and ornate. It had 2 apses, which you can see on the sides. These are the semicircular recesses, and these were on each short end. The basilica itself was 400 feet long and over 200 feet wide. The entry was through a gateway. The entry to the forum was through a gateway resembling a triumphant arch. Also, throughout the entire forum, there were other works that celebrated Trajan and his accomplishments. An example that's actually pictured in here, you can see in the middle of the forum square, not quite the middle. There was actually a larger than life gilded bronze statue of Trajan on horseback, and he was actually trampling a Dacian underneath the horse's hooves. And so the artwork was again commemorating and celebrating Trajan's accomplishments. Another work that does this is the Column of Trajan that was dedicated in 112 CE. Now it still stands today and is almost perfectly preserved. It's 128 feet high, and on top there was a heroically nude statue of Trajan. However, now it was St. Peter, and that was changed in the 16th century. It's on a tall pedestal, and this tall pedestal was actually once Trajan's tomb. It's believed the architect of this is also Apollodorus, but we're not 100% sure. But what the column is most well known for is the spiral frieze that is a record of Trajan's 2 military campaigns against the Dacians. And so what this spiral frieze is literally means it's a continual spiral around the entire column, not different panels as we've seen before. Now, this is not historically 100% reliable, but we do get some information from it. It has over 150 different episodes on it and over 2,500 figures. Now, what's interesting is the bands actually get wider at the top to make it easier to see the relief from the ground. These were also all done in low relief so they don't block the view from any level. The construction of it's also very interesting. It's actually made from hollow marble drums, and those had to be made first. And these are hollow because actually inside the column, there is a spiral staircase that goes the entire length. Then after they constructed the marble drums, you then constructed the column, and then the artist created the friezes. And they actually carved from the top down. That way, pieces of falling marble would not damage the lower friezes. Well, after Trajan, we have Hadrian. He ruled 117 to 138, and he was Trajan's chosen successor. He was 41, and he ruled for over 2 decades. And he was a lover of all the arts, and actually was an author, an architect, and an avid hunter. And he especially greatly admired Greek culture. He often traveled, and wherever he went, they would set up statues and arches in his honor. And because of that, we have more portraits of Hadrian than any other emperor except Augustus. Now, what's interesting in these portraits is he is shown as a mature man, but he never ages. Now, this is not an idealized portrait like the portraits of Augustus were, but what we see is it's not modeled on the athletes, but on the classical statues of bearded adults. After Hadrian, beards actually then became the norm for emperors after this for more than a century and a half. And you can see that in the example of the bust here. This is from 117 to 120. Probably one of Hadrian's greatest building projects was the Pantheon, which is in Rome, Italy. It was completed in 125 CE, and it is a temple of all gods. Now, construction began shortly after, some think maybe before, he became emperor. Unfortunately, we do not know the architect because this building is one of the greatest architectural achievements in history. Now, he actually also did not take credit for it. He dedicated it to Marcus Agrippa, who had built an earlier Pantheon on this site. This is also one of the best preserved buildings of antiquity, and it's one of the most influential designs in architectural history, and it shows the full potential of concrete. Originally, you would approach it through a columnar courtyard, and it stood at one end. On the left, you can see the facade has 8 Corinthian columns, and then inside what we have is an immense concrete cylinder covered by a huge hemispherical dome. The dome is 142 feet in diameter, and the top is 142 feet from the floor. So basically, the design is the intersection of two circles. The oculus, which is the circular opening that you can see on the interior picture on the right, the diameter of the oculus is 30 feet in diameter. And the construction of the Pantheon is also very important. So what they did first is they built the drum level by using different compositions of concrete. For example, the lower levels had bauxite into the mixture to create a very strong foundation. And then by the time we get to the top of the dome, we have featherweight pumice, like think of a pumice stone. Those were used to replace other heavier stones. Also, the dome's thickness decreases as it goes higher. They also used coffers, which you can see again in the right image, and these are sunken in decorative panels, and this also lessened the load, meaning you didn't have to have it, the whole thing as solid concrete. And so what this does is this created this vast open space and something we had not seen before. Also, your textbook, you can look at the pool and the artificial grotto at Hadrian's villa in Trivoli shows another good example of the blending and manipulation of Greek architecture. You can also see this at the tomb nicknamed the Cosne in Petra, Jordan. Now, what's also interesting is at this time that 90% of Rome's population of close to 1 million people lived in multi-story apartment buildings. These were often made of brick-faced concrete buildings, and you can see an example here. Now, these multi-story insulae, which means a block of grouped but often separate buildings or a single structure, they had the brick facades, and these brick facades were not covered. On the first floor, they would be taken up with shops, and then you would usually have 4 floors of apartments above them. Now, these only had narrow light wells or small courtyards, so inside they were actually usually very dark. The residents actually cooked in the hallways, and only the most deluxe apartments had private bathrooms. Others shared a latrine, and these usually were on different floors. Before he died, Hadrian adopted 51-year-old Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 CE. And then as part of this, he also had him adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Marcus Aurelius ruled from 161 to 180, and Lucius Verus ruled from 161 to 169. So they were actually co-emperors for a while. And so what Hadrian was doing was he was ensuring the next several successions. Again, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus were co-emperors until Lucius's death. Now, what we're going to look at here is the column of Antoninus. Remember, this is Antoninus Pius, who was Hadrian's successor. This is circa 161 CE, and this was after his death. The co-emperors erected a memorial column for him. There was a bronze portrait of him on top, and then the pedestal on the front had a dedication inscription, and then 3 friezes on the other sides. Now, the rear frieze, which is the image of the left, shows his apotheosis. Remember, that's the ascending to heavens. He's shown with his wife. You can see kind of in the upper center. He's shown with his wife, and what's interesting, though, is his wife actually died some 20 years before him. This frieze is done in the classical tradition. It's elegant, well-proportioned figures, and it has those personifications. You see Mars on the left and the personification of Roma on the right. And then also the figure, we see a winged figure taking them up to heaven, but we're not really sure who this figure was. And then also, this has the classical tradition of a single ground line. Like, we know where the ground is, and then going up to the heavens. Now, the other 2 reliefs show what's called a decursio. And the decursio is actually a ritual of circling the imperial funerary pyre. Now, these reliefs actually break with classical convention. The figures in them are much stockier, And the ground is actually the whole surface of the relief. So the marching soldiers and horses stand on what seem to be like floating patches of earth. This type of art, this style, had been done in the art of the non-elites, but this is the first time it appears in imperial art. Artists of the higher classes started adopting these non-classical conventions of the art of the lower classes, and this represents a major turning point in Roman art. And we're going to see that in this work here too. This is a statue of Marcus Aurelius. Again, his rule was 161 to 180. And we're going to see, much like the relief panels here did, also the portraits are breaking with past tradition. Here we see him on an equestrian statue, which means he's on a horse. Circa 175 CE, this is a bronze, and it's 11 feet 6 inches high. Now, it shows him showing that, the traditional possession of grandeur, and he is actually larger in relationship to the horse than a normal human would be. Like, look at it. Like, he's almost, if he stood up, he would almost be as tall as the horse himself. Beneath the horse's raised right hoof, there actually used to be an enemy there begging for mercy. Now, imperial equestrian portraits were popular, but few have survived. In the Middle Ages, they actually would often melt down to reuse the bronze. This one survives because they actually thought it was Constantine, the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. So that's why it survived the Middle Ages, which are heavily dominated by the church, because they believe this was actually Constantine. Now, this is also the first work that shows the emperor as weary, saddened, and even worried. It shows the strain the ruling of the empire had on the ruler. And again, this was also a major turning point in the history of ancient art. With the changes in relief sculpture, and these shown here, we're beginning to see the end of classical art's domination in the Greco-Roman world. Now, with these changes, we're actually going to then transition into the late empire. And what happens now, where the High Empire was the height of the Roman Empire, now we're going to begin to see the Roman Empire start to erode and to crumble. What happens is they begin to have trouble keeping order on the frontiers. There were some rebellions within the empire, and also we're going to see economic decline and rising of Eastern cults, meaning different religions, including Christianity. Now, with the assassination of Marcus' son, Commodus, in 192, this brought an end to the Antonine dynasty. The late empire was a time when the classical world of multiple gods gradually gave way to the Christian Middle Ages. After Commodus' death, there was a civil conflict, and the African-born general Septimius Servius became the ruler, and he ruled from 193 to 211 CE. And this established a dynasty that would rule for about 50 years. Now, portraiture at this time, again, is changing. Septimus declared that he was Marcus Aurelius' son, and so he is often depicted with the long hair and beard that Marcus Aurelius wore. Also, he was often shown with his gray hair, showing again that he was older. Now, portraits of his son and successor, Caracalla, show his ruthless persona, and we're actually looking at a bust of Caracalla here. When he became the emperor, he actually had his younger brother murdered, and then he murdered his own wife and father-in-law to ensure his rule. So here he is shown in the heroic nudity, but we do see a new hairstyle. He still has the curly hair and the beard, but it is actually much shorter. And this actually started a new fashion for men in the 3rd century CE. But we also see here his brow is knotted and his head is turned over his left shoulder. And some people think this was meant to show his ruthlessness. Note, he was assassinated in 217 CE. Then we're going to look at what's now known as the late antique style. And this is shown in a relief from the Arch of Septimus Servius, 203 CE. This is marble, 5 feet 6 inches. And what we see here is it shows a chariot procession, but not ones like we've seen before. There's no sense of rushing motion. There's this stately stillness to it, if you will. And then the emperor and his sons actually face the viewer. That's frontal facing. Also, if you look, the second row of people, the row of people that are supposed to be behind, they actually seem to be floating. They're not on the ground. And this was done so the viewer can clearly see them. Think if this was actually, if you were looking at people walking down the street, the person in the front of you, you would see, but the person beside them, you really would not see. Here, the artist makes it so they're, above that first person, so they are clearly shown. Now, again, what's interesting was this was done in the works of the lower classes, but it was not done in imperial artworks. And so this is the first time we are seeing it in an imperial work. And this change, again, is a reflection of the social, political, and economic upheaval of the time, and it becomes known as the late antique style. Now, after the Severan dynasty ended with the murder of Servius Alexander in 235 CE, we go into a time of almost 50 years of constant civil war. And what happens, these are what's known as the soldier emperors. And general after general became emperor. They didn't rule for long, sometimes months, maybe a year or two. And then they were often murdered and ousted and murdered by another general. No emperor at this time ruled long enough to have any significant building programs. Money and coins were created almost constantly. Why? Because when you got a new ruler, you put their likeness on the coins and the money. Because if you had ousted the person in front of you, you wouldn't want their image to still be on the coins and the money. Having your image on the coins and money is part of establishing yourself as ruler. Also, as each new ruler came into power, they would set up portraits and busts pretty much everywhere to again assert their authority. Also, there are few of these that remain because the new ruler would then often destroy them. Now, what's known though is they were notable for their emotional content, and you see that in the bust on the left. This is a bust of the Emperor Trajan Decius, rule 249 to 251. Now, he was best known for persecuting the Christians, and you see here he is shown as an old man with bags under his eyes and deep wrinkles. He looks off to the side, not meeting the viewer's gaze. And we see this sad expression, and it's thought that this is meant to show his anxiety. And it's revealing the anguish souls of the man of the times. And so it wasn't just a reflection of him, but of these turbulent and turmoil times. Now, by the 3rd century CE, burial became more widespread. Remember, before we mainly were cremating. More of the lower classes had started with burials, but the imperial classes had not. However, by the 3rd century, as it became more widespread, imperial families also practiced it. And so sarcophagi were more popular than ever. The relief we're looking at here is from one that was discovered in Rome in 621, and the collection of Cardinal Ludovico Lodovici, and his dates were 1595 to 1632. Now, what this shows, though, is it shows a battle between the Romans and an enemy. It is believed this was created between 250 and 260 CE, and it is a marble that is 5 feet high. Now, this again is different than the classical forms. We see within it the writhing and highly emotive figures, and they're evenly placed across the entire relief, and there's no illusion of space in this. Like, if you look at it, it's action-packed and it's very, very crowded. And this again was a clear rejection of the classical perspective. Also, much of the architecture in the 3rd century also ignored the rules of classical design. Now, what happens in an attempt to restore order? Remember, we had civil war, general after general, emperor after emperor. Well, what happens is Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305, he decided he would actually share his power with potential rivals. And what he did was he divided the empire into 4 sections, the East and the West. And you would have the Augustus of the East, the Augustus of the West, the Caesar of the East, and the Caesar of the West. And this was established in 293, and it's called the Tetrarchy, and that means rule of 4. And so you have these 4 different rulers, and it actually worked. They ruled without strife until Diocletian retired in 305. Now, often they were shown in group portraits as a way to show this harmonious rule, and that's what you see here. This one's circa 300, and it's on porphyry, which is a type of rock, and it's 4 feet 3 inches. And you can clearly see all 4 rulers, each of them, 2 embracing each other. Now, what happens after he abdicates or resigns, civil war does resume. However, this division of the empire into East and West would remain through the Middle Ages. We would have the Latin West and the Byzantine, the Greek or the Byzantine East. Now, we're going to conclude this section by looking at Constantine. Constantine ruled from 306 to 337 CE. Now, Constantine's father had been the Caesar of the West, one of the Tetrarchy, but eventually what happens is Constantine comes to power, and he invaded Italy in 312 CE. He defeated one of the other 4, and so then he had a co-emperor, so there were 2 of them ruling. And in 313, he and the co-emperor in the East issued what's called the Edict of Milan, and this ended the persecutions of Christians. He and Licinius, who was the co-emperor, then did eventually become foes, and Constantine defeated and executed him in 324. So this then made Constantine the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. What he did, though, was he actually founded what he called a new Rome at Byzantium and named it Constantinople. In 325 with CE, with the Council of Nicaea, Christianity became the de facto official religion of the Roman Empire. And in fact, in 337, Constantine was baptized on his deathbed. So this transfer of the seat of power from Rome to Constantinople and the recognition of Christianity marks the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. And the art of the time reflects this change also. Now, Constantine did have a building program like other emperors. He built public baths, basilica, and a triumphal arch, but he was also a patron to the city's first churches. What we're looking at here, this is the Arch of Constantine, 312 to 315 CE. This was erected by the Senate to commemorate Constantine's defeat of Maxentius. It is a triple passageway arch, and it's actually located next to the Colosseum in Rome. What's interesting about this is most of the sculptural ornaments are actually reused sculptures, meaning they had been somewhere else and they took them here and they reused them on the arch. Also, the relief sculptures are seen as not having a very high standard. And so there's actually a debate over if this is showing a decline of form or if it was a way to link Constantine with earlier rulers and art styles. Next, we'll look at the Colossus of Constantine. Remember, the Colossus is a giant statue, circa 315 to 330 CE. And what we're looking at is a fragment. This was broken apart, and this is a fragment of the head. It was made of marble, and it's 8 feet 6 inches. So that gives you an idea of how large or colossal this work was. And this was What we're going to see in portraits of Constantine is it resuscitated the Augustan image of a perpetually youthful leader. And you can see that in the fragment shown here. This sculpture was originally in the Basilica Nova. And again, just this fragment is 8.5 feet. The limbs and heads of the sculpture were marble, and then it had a brick core and a wood torso that were covered in bronze. Extended in his left hand, he held an orb representing global power. Now, this is a frontal facing, but we really don't see any expression within this. There's not the anguish or emotion that we saw in some of the earlier works in this lecture. Now, what's also interesting is the coins of the time also show this change. And so here you see two examples. The top coin shows Constantine at the beginning of his rule, when his power was uncertain. He's shown as older and in the style of the Tetrarchs. In fact, the only reason why we even know this is Constantine is because it's engraved with his name. Now, the lower coin is 8 years later, and this is when he's the unchallenged ruler of the West. Here, he is clean-shaven and he looks younger. And so these coins definitely show how the portraits were used by the rulers. Again, they're this often fictitious, and they were created in a way to suit the needs of the rulers. Now, the lower coin also shows the duality of Constantine's rule. He is shown as the ruler. He's dressed in armor, he's wearing a helmet, and he's carrying a shield that shows the she-wolf suckling or nursing Romulus and Remus, right? The founders, Romulus, the founder of Rome. But it also shows him as a Christian. He is holding a cross that's crowned by an orb, and the disc on his helmet contains what's called the Christogram, which is a monogram made up of the initial letters in Christ's name in Greek. And so again, it shows this duality. It shows him both as the emperor and as a soldier in the army of the Lord. And so these works belong in both the ancient world and the medieval world. So we can see them almost as this transition from the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages. And we will explore that more in the upcoming lectures.